This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and this interview is being recorded on the premises of the annual conference of the Association for Israel Studies here at Brandeis University. My guest today is a professor at the Faculty of Letters at the University of Bucharest in Romania. She is the author of a new book entitled Tales and Traces of Sephardic Bucharest. Recently it came out in English. Professor Felicia Waldman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you.
So, Sephardic Bucharest as opposed to Ashkenazi Bucharest?
Yes, we did publish a book on the Jews of Bucharest 6 years ago. That was the first volume. And during the research that we did for that book, we discovered that there's much less known about the Sephardic community than about the Ashkenazi community, because they were different, they were separate.
Yeah, so did they really coexist in Bucharest at the same time? What was the origins of both?
Well, it's a long story, a really long story. The Sephardic history in Bucharest goes back for about 500 years. The Sephardim arrived in the Danubian principalities, in the Romanian principalities, sometime in the 16th century. They were probably there before, but these are the first documents that we have in 1550. Afterwards, of course, their numbers increased.
They came after the expulsion from Spain?
Yes, apparently. Okay, now, the first Jews mentioned in what is today Romania were mentioned in about 1394, so very, very early. But these were mostly Ashkenazi Jews traveling. They were not settled. The first information we have about settled Jews comes from 1550, and these were indeed Sephardic Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492 and then from Portugal in 1497.
So the Sephardim preceded the Ashkenazi Jews
in settled communities, yes. The first communities mentioned are all Sephardic, and they came to the Romanian lands from the Ottoman Empire, not directly from Spain. What we know is that...
That's why it took them
a little bit.
About half a century.
Yes, about 50 years.
Yeah.
But actually what we think is that because we have settlements in the 16th century, it means they probably were there before. These are the first documents that we have, but they were probably before. And the documents that we have from 1550, although it was not a community recognized as such by the authorities, we have documents from a number of years, like 1550, then 1559, and so on, which mention the same names and the same problems, so that means they were settled. Mm-hmm. However, the first community recognized as a community by the authorities was in 1694, when they were they were recognized as a guild, as it was called at the time, not community, but a guild, let's say ethnic guild, and because it was not religious, because they were one guild with the Armenians. The Jews and the Armenians were one guild, and they paid taxes together.
But what did Romania look like at the time? Who was the government? What was the state?
Romania is actually composed of 3 different principalities. The Principality of Wallachia, the Principality of Moldova, and the Principality of Transylvania. The Principalities of Moldova and Wallachia had, let's say, more common history than Transylvania. Transylvania had a totally different history because of the geographic location, but the Principalities of Moldova and Wallachia, which was the so-called Romanian principalities, they shared a lot in history, although they were separate for a very long time. Romania was actually set up in 1859 through the unification of Moldova and Wallachia.
But in the 16th century...
They were different principalities.
Different principalities, yes. And independent ones? Or?
Yes, they were independent all the time. They were under the sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire, but they were not part of the Ottoman Empire like other parts of Europe. So
when the Jews arrived from the Ottoman Empire, it seemed like the natural place to go, because it it was under in the Ottoman orbit.
Yes, yes. And they settled in Bucharest because it was a very good transit place for trade between East and West. This was a very good route for the Ottoman goods to reach Western Europe, and from Western Europe to reach the Ottoman and the Orient in general.
And when did the Ashkenazi come?
Well, most of the Ashkenazis came actually after the Cossack massacres of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in 1648-49. So it was mostly after 1650 that they started settling in big numbers, especially in Moldova, less in Wallachia, where they came later. So in Moldova, they came in big numbers at the end of the 17th century.
Mm-hmm. And in Bucharest, the Jewish community was predominantly Sephardi, even in terms of numbers?
The Sephardi community in Bucharest was the most long-lived, but it was never the biggest. Well, except for the beginning, when it was the only one.
Yeah.
But after the arrival of the Ashkenazi Jews very soon outnumbered the Sephardic Jews. However, their separate community was only recognized much later. So they did have bigger numbers, but as a community they were recognized much later.
And were they completely separate?
Yes, they were separate. However, in at least in the Romanian principalities, the Sephardi community always helped the Ashkenazi community. Sephardi community was always, let's say, richer and more integrated in the sense that the Sephardi community had very good relations with the authorities, and that's why they were recognized very early. And they usually integrated easier in the majority societies through the language, because they spoke Spanish, and Spanish is a Latin language like Romanian. So it was very easy to relate to the Romanian language, and for the Romanians to relate to the Hispanic language that they spoke. And also they gave up traditional clothing and traditional habits in public, and therefore they were not so visible as the Ashkenazi Jews, who were generally religious and visible in terms of clothing and in terms of the way they behaved. So they were easily targeted as foreigners, while the Sephardim were very integrated, less visible.
But were they welcomed in any way by the now established Sephardi community? Were there any cross community Sephardi Ashkenazi ties?
Yes. The Sephardi community always helped. We have documents which show that they always helped the Ashkenazi community. The Ashkenazi community being bigger and less potent financially and less access to education and so on. The Sephardi community gave them access to their schools without any payment, and they allowed them to take part in all kinds of social services that provided by the Sephardi community. So they always helped, including in the relations with the authorities. Mm-hmm. So we know that the Sephardim all intermediated between the Ashkenazi community and the authorities.
And today the community is predominantly Sephardi or Ashkenazi?
Well, this is the problem. This is one of the reasons why we wrote this book. The Sephardi community, as I said, was the most long-lived and the most important, but it was always small in numbers. And during the Second World War, some, of course, died during the war. They were killed in various events that took place, either deported to Transnistria, where the Romanian Jews, or killed in various pogroms and so on. But quite a number migrated to South America, especially because of the Spanish language, and some
Still,
to Israel.
It survived all these generations.
Exactly. This is a very nice story which we use in the book. In 1903, a Spanish Catholic senator, Angelo Pulido Fernandez, took a trip on the Danube in the region, not specifically to the Romanian lands, but on the Danube in the region. And on this trip, he met Jaime Bejarano, who was the head of the Sephardic school in Bucharest, the boys' school in Bucharest, and who told him about the traditions and the language and the habits of the Sephardim in Bucharest and the Romanian lands in general. So Pulido was very impressed, and he came on a visit. And he saw that these Sephardim preserved the language and the traditions, but also an incredible love of Spain. Spain to them was still the lost land, the lost motherland. And therefore he was so impressed, he went back to Spain, and in the Senate in Madrid, he tried to get interest and get favor for a law to give them citizenship, Spanish citizenship. That was the first attempt to get Spanish citizenship for the Sephardim. Unfortunately, his attempt was not successful. They did not give them this citizenship, but it raised interest. And suddenly, these communities, which were long forgotten for the Spanish milieus, suddenly gained importance, and they were rediscovered. Mm-hmm. So this is one reason why we have this information. Especially, Pulido wrote 3 books, 2 of which as a result of these trips, in which he records all these interesting stories and interesting names and people and communities.
How hard was it really to uncover these stories that have in large part been forgotten?
Exactly. They were forgotten, unfortunately. For instance, Pulido's books, although they are so important in terms of Sephardic history in general for the Balkanic region, they were never republished and they were never translated in any other language. So we discovered them by chance, looking for information about Romanian Sephardim, and the rediscovery of the books brought finally last year an English translation of one of them. So finally there is interest in this important information about not only about Romanian Sephardic communities but also about other communities, Sephardic communities in the Balkans. Because
yeah, exactly. This is exactly that was going to be exactly my next question.
Yeah.
How similar and how different is the Sephardic community, the history of the Sephardic community in Bucharest, as opposed to other former Spanish communities in southeastern Europe, that part of Europe that Romania is in?
Well, it's interesting because in general, because the Romanian lands were not part of the Ottoman Empire, they had a, let's say, different history, different approach to the existence of the community. Inside the Ottoman Empire, in Bulgaria, Serbia, and other places, life was in a way easier because the Ottoman system, the Ottoman millet system, provided some freedom for the Jewish communities. Inside the Romanian principalities, it depended on the ruler. Sometimes the ruler would make new regulations which would give the Jews in general and Sephardim in particular some facilities to boost economy, local economy. But then sometimes when the economy started growing and they thought they don't need the Jews anymore, they kind of put pressure and sometimes even persecuted the Jewish communities. But generally, due to the Ottoman influence, the communities had a regular life, a normal life. What we can say is that there was a lot of communication and a lot of connections through family relations and business relations between the Sephardim in Romania and the Sephardim in the Balkans, the Ottoman Balkans. They were related also as families because they usually got married for commercial reasons. They got married to these families, and we have, for instance, families that have members in Adrianopole, today Edirne, in Constantinople, today Istanbul, and Bucharest, and then Vienna and Paris. So connections were throughout the region, not only in the Balkans, but also to Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. But the stories themselves of the communities had quite a few similarities because of the Ottoman influence,
yes,
right?
Exactly. So because of the Ottoman influence, there's a lot of similarities between the histories of these communities, and the story changes actually in the 19th century when even before the independence of the Romanian lands from the Ottomans, because there's a lot of the Ottoman influence is not mandatory. That is, the Ottomans did not impose how the Romanian rulers should treat the Jewish communities, the local Jewish communities. It was just an example, an influence, but not always taken as the best way to deal with the Jewish communities. And therefore, during the 19th century, things began to change. And we have these funny stories where the Ottoman Jews who came from the Ottoman Empire and were Ottoman subjects, in fact. And I have one example in the book, Hillel Manoach, who was the representative of the Sultan himself. He was actually recorded in Romania. He was registered as an Austrian subject. Because the Ottoman Empire, having sovereignty over the Romanian lands, did not have a representative office, and it had agreements with the local rulers to pay the taxes in exchange for certain things. But this was not this had nothing to do with the treatment of the Jews. In the opposite case, for instance, in the case of Austria, Austria had a kind of an embassy. At the time it was called a mission, a legation. So they had a legation in Bucharest, and the legation always intervened in favor of its subjects, even if its subjects were Jews. It didn't matter. So because the Austrian authorities always intervened...
That's 19th century.
Yes, 19th century. Because the Austrian authorities intervened in favor of their subjects, many Jews registered as Austrian subjects to get some protection. So
could they do it that easily?
Well, it was easy if you had money.
Yeah.
I mean, it cost a lot of money, so generally you have the... that's why most of the Sephardim did that, because they had money. They were richer. They could afford to pay the tax to become Austrian subjects. Mm-hmm. But this is a very interesting development in the 19th century when things begin to change in the Romanian...
And also, what about the rise of Romanian nationalism also around
yes,
the 19th century?
Exactly.
How did the Jews fit into that scheme of things?
This is also an interesting story because until about 1831-32, Jews, as I said, had a normal life. They had the facilities and they had rights. There were so-called native Jews who were born in the Romanian lands, and there were foreign Jews who came as foreign subjects. But then in 1831-32, both principalities, Moldova and Wallachia, imposed new laws, unfortunately based on Russian models, where they outlawed the Jews. So Jews suddenly became foreigners, even those who were born in Romania and who were there for generations already. So they became foreigners, and therefore in 1848, when the Romanian lands also went through a revolution like in other places in Europe, one of the demands of the Romanian revolutionaries was the naturalization of the Jews. So many Jews supported this revolution, including Sephardim, who sponsored financially the revolutionaries and who made the connections with the West. Because they had the connections with the Western world, they helped the revolutionaries connect with the West. The revolution was not successful in the sense that it did not change the ruling system. After the revolution, the Ottomans still had sovereignty over the Romanian lands until 1877, the independence war. And in the following years, that is especially after 1859, when the two principalities united under one ruler, the new ruler actually did issue a law for the naturalization of the Jews. Unfortunately, very soon after he gave this law, he was taken over by somebody else. I mean, he was replaced by another ruler, by the local boyars, by the local noblemen, the nobility. He was replaced, and this law was never enforced. And afterwards, very soon afterwards, in fact, in 1866, when the Romanians decided to have a king and invited the German family of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen to come and rule the country, the nationalist Romanians, the nationalist politicians started gaining ground, and the new constitution in 1866 provided that the Jews were still foreigners. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the Jews were naturalized as a community, as a population, as a minority in its entirety. They were only naturalized in 1923. It was the last country in Europe to naturalize the Jews.
So what were they until then? Just
foreigners.
Foreigners,
or
but they were allowed to stay,
or without any country,
right.
Because not all of them were registered with other authorities, so that they could be called foreign subjects. Some of them were apatrids, as we call them. So.
Okay, we did talk about the tales of Sephardic Bucharest and how difficult it was to uncover them. But what about the traces of Sephardic Bucharest? What really are the monuments and the physical traces that are still there and that you explore in your...
Well, that's another problem. It was very hard to find information about the Sephardim in Bucharest because despite the fact that they had a separate community and this community was so old, because the community disappeared during the Second World War, when, as I said, many died, many were able to leave to go to especially South America, but also Israel and North America. At the end of the war, the communists, when they came to power, decided to dismantle the Sephardic community for two reasons. One was the members were so few, they did not justify a separate community. And on the other hand, of course, it was the communist idea of control. You can control much easier one community than two.
Yeah.
So therefore, they united the communities into one. And in 1965, because the Sephardim had become so few, they did not even justify a section inside the community. They disappeared altogether. Today, there are less than 100 Sephardim in all over Romania, so it's really disappearing. That was one of the reasons why we wanted to write this history before they all disappear.
Yeah.
The problem was that there are no records, there are no documents. The Jewish community during the communist time, for obvious reasons, destroyed some of the documentation because of the communist control and the communist idea of getting especially real estate, especially properties and so on. Some documents were taken over by the state and never given back, and so on. So basically, there's very little information. You really have to dig in all kinds of archival sources, in not only the Jewish community, but also in the National Archive, local archives, and so on.
Do you feel that the book is exhaustive in this sense?
No, of course not. I mean, that's the idea. We wanted with the book to open the interest, to open a page in the study of the Romanian Sephardim. That's why the book is composed of several let's say, directions. It's not only a historical book, but it also talks about personalities. It talks about, let's say, success stories, businesses, the contribution of the Sephardim to the urban development, and so on. Because there are many aspects in this history, and of course, we cannot cover them all. Yeah. The idea is to have others start looking for information, documentation, and proofs.
Okay, so perhaps upon the publication of your next book about Sephardic Romania,
absolutely, there's still a lot.
We'll do another interview. Dr. Felicia Waldman, professor at the Faculty of Letters at the University of Bucharest and the author of the new book, Tales and Traces of Sephardic Bucharest. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host Daria Shenlin will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, visit our website, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and tune in again for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review next week. And until then, goodbye.